Okay, great. I'm going to get started by introducing our panelists. Our first of four panelists is Lana Weidgenant. She's a climate justice activist and a youth climate activist who specializes in the intersection of food and diets with the climate crisis. Lana was the youth vice chair of Shifting to Sustainable Consumption for the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit and currently works as a campaigns and policy manager for food awareness organization for Pro-Veg International. Our second of four panelists is a professor here at the Friedman School, Erin Coughlan de Perez. She comes from the Feinstein Center, from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, where she built a global climate science team and led the first forecast-based financing pilots in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. She works with humanitarian teams on the development of early action protocols to avoid disaster impacts, and she researches the adoption and effectiveness of climate change and adaptation measures.
Our third panelist today is Stephanie Goodwin. Stephanie Goodwin has been with Danone in North America for 7 years, first on the science team for the Division of Medical Foods, and then the Public and Government Affairs team. Prior to joining Danone, Stephanie worked within the Human of Assistant Secretary for Health, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services on the 2015 dietary guidelines. And last but not least, our fourth panelist is Carly Kelso. Carly Kelso is the director of a climate resilient food systems at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she builds partnerships to elevate and advocate for the recognition of blue foods in contributing to global nutrition security and in enhancing resiliency to climate change and other global disruptions like the COVID-19 pandemic. She leads the Secretariat for Blue Aquatic Foods Action Coalition, established in the 2021 United Food Systems Summit.
Thank you, Sadie. And those are our four panelists today. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Lana's lightning presentation.
Thank you. Let me cue that up for us. And I'm excited to start on the topic of youth activism. My work has also touched on climate action and food systems, also the Food Systems Summit, but I'm excited to focus more on the youth advocacy efforts. You've probably heard of the youth climate movement and the youth climate strikes, and that's also touched a bit on the food and nutrition area. So I think that's pretty exciting. One key area to note is Youngo. That is the official mechanism by which young people can be engaged in UN climate change. So I'm going to start by setting that out a little bit, and then what's happened before with COP26 last year that many of us were involved in, and what's coming up for COP27 this year. So Youngo is what organizes the youth representation to the UN climate change that hosts the COP conferences or the UN climate change conferences. So we can have a global youth statement that officially goes to the COP27 or COP26 organizers last year. It gives young people access to in speaking and negotiations, and more in the food and nutrition area. We also have an agriculture working group and a campaign about the food that is served on the menu and on the agenda at the COPs. So through the agriculture working group, we're able to have young people bring more bold statements in the agriculture negotiations, which are called Cornevia Joint Work on Agriculture. We're also able to do submissions, such as some of the topics right now is what is the negotiations going to talk about in future years and in future sessions, such as this year. So we're able to bring priorities there. And then we also have an international campaign that has been focusing around the importance of climate-friendly food, such as healthy, sustainable diets in the climate conference. And you can see a picture there from last year. Last year, the COP, which I'm sure many others will touch on as well, took place in Glasgow, Scotland in November 2021. And for the Food at COP campaign there, we ended up having the campaign ask of 100% plant-based for last year. That was due to our consultations with young people under the Youngo mechanism. We heard from young people that they wanted a really climate-focused ask, such as something correlating with low greenhouse gas emissions, and also something bold that related to climate And then to also open up the conversation more into affordability of food, seasonal food, things like that, but starting out with really climate focus. So that might change for this year, but that's what happened last year. And we ended up having a campaign also to directly hear from those young people around the world, in which they were able to talk about why does this matter to them? What else is important, such as seasonal food and other topics. That caught the attention of the COP26 team. So we were able to have some more in-depth conversations about food at COP with the civil society, the youth team, and then it was a little bit harder with the events and sustainability coordinators, which we really wanted to talk to, but they were not open to meeting. We did, however, able to send some emails and some information to different team members. And then we ended up with the outcome of a 40% plant-based commitment. We haven't been able to analyze what we really saw there, if it was ultimately that commitment of at least 40% plant-based, but it was good to see that it was acknowledged to think about more climate friendliness in food, to think about sustainability in terms of the catering and the importance of the topic. So we did see some outcomes compared to previous years. This isn't really something that had been considered very much. And I also want to acknowledge some other youth efforts that happened in those 2 weeks where we were on the ground engaging in the hecticness of the climate negotiations. So one aspect is, of course, speaking in the Cornivia negotiations, advocating for more sustainable production, such as agroecology is one aspect that ended up kind of in the brackets. It could pass and has some potential. We also have an initiative called Act for Food, Act for Change, in which we had many events such as the one pictured, where young people are able to talk and bring our voices in directly. And we shared out a youth letter on the importance of healthy, sustainable diets. That was one of the top priorities that came out from the Food Systems Summit. And if we share this out afterwards, I also have a link there. And we also had a team on the ground for people who weren't in these events already in these negotiations, sharing out some more cards and stickers of information. So what's coming up this year? I think one really exciting aspect is that there might be a food day, or potentially called an agriculture day at COP27. Ultimately, this is something that will be decided by the Egyptian presidency, which is hosting the COP this year. So it'll be up to them whether they accept the proposal, but we can still have some meetings and advocate for this. It could be very exciting to have it on the main theme, the main agenda. The campaign we're also focusing on is having the African-based youth leaders from the Food at COP campaign kind of take the lead this year. And something that they want to highlight is more indigenous fruits and vegetables, more traditional cuisine, and also talking about health and sustainability in food. So stay tuned. If you go to the Food at COP Instagram, you'll be seeing some more information about that soon in the months coming up to COP27. And then my personal, what I'm really excited about is the possibility of a pavilion. So if you have been to a COP before, you might notice that in the negotiation space, or the blue zone, there are also these spaces where there are events and meetings, and they're focused on different topics. So making sure that we have a space to really establish a strong presence and discussion of food and agriculture at the COP27 is a very exciting possibility. It will take some work and some budget as well, but we're hoping to bring together a lot of diverse stakeholders in the food system space to make it possible. And with that quick lightning talk, I'm happy to take any other questions that come up based on this. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Lana. What a great presentation. That was a lot of food for thought, to fully intend the pun. I just want to remind everybody that we're going to take questions at the end. Please feel free to put your questions at any time into the chat box, but we will get to you with those questions at the end. And now, Erin, we'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you. Fascinating to hear about this work, and I look forward to the question and the discussion. So for now, I'll take us in a different route, looking a bit more at the consequences of climate change. So I'm a climate scientist, and we just released the second working group of the most recent IPCC report. So this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We were 290 authors from around the world, nominated by governments to do a holistic assessment of what is going on with climate change. There are three parts. The first part was basically the atmosphere, what's going on in the atmosphere. The second part, which we released on Monday, is about impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So how does climate change impact humans and ecosystems around the world? And then the third part that will come out at the end of the month is about mitigation. How can we reduce and decarbonize? That, of course, will have lots of very interesting information about food systems, and so stay tuned for that. What I'll do now is give you some of the highlights from Monday's report that are related to the discussion today, and a little bit of a deep dive into my own work in adaptation. So let's see here. So one of the key figures from chapter 5, the chapter on food, fiber, and ecosystem products, is this one showing that, you know, these timelines of climate impacts on food production around the world. So they've organized them by crop production, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture. And you can see in these timelines that we have seen shocks over and over again that have been negatively impacting a number of these food production systems. And these are the kinds of impacts that we are expecting to see happen more frequently and more severely in the future, given climate change. However, the chapter, of course, points out that the pathways by which climate change impacts the food system are complex. We're not just looking at impacts to food production, right? So, of course, that is one of the most obvious and the biggest pathways. For example, reducing yields. But we're also looking at impacts to post-harvest, and storage. So pests and disease, after harvest, transportation. We saw some really interesting, interesting is the wrong word. We saw some really shocking problems after some flooding in British Columbia, for example, a few months ago, where they were unable to transport milk, for example, that had been produced in one place to another place because roads were washed out from the floods. And then, of course, we do see changes to people's ability to consume food, spoilage and disease and pathogen incidence is a big problem. So with this context, the IPCC pointed out quite starkly that this threatens our ability to achieve the major goals that we have put out as a society, right? So SDG 2, the second Sustainable Development Goal, is zero hunger, which was for 2030. And climate change is really putting a barrier in place, an additional barrier to our efforts to try to achieve this kind of goal. However, of course, there is room for hope. Essentially, we need to be looking at integrated policy strategies that look at the food system holistically and look at how we can achieve a low emissions, sustainable and resilient future in a more holistic way if we're actually going to achieve these commitments that we have across society. So to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we discussed in terms of adaptation, here in gray on the left is a list of a whole bunch of different adaptation options, and you don't need to read them all, but what I'd like to point out here is on the right, all these beautiful bright colors are showing synergies with different sustainable development goals. And so this column right here, this sort of yellowy, orangey color, are all these synergies that we see with SDG 2, the one on zero hunger. And so you can see that a lot of these adaptation options that we are promoting, like improved cropland management, sustainable water management, etc., have positive synergies with these sustainable development goals, often across the board. And so our goal here is to talk about these integrated solutions across food systems and beyond, of course, to how we can adapt to climate change and deal with these increasing threats to our food system and our health. One note as we are doing this is that our own responses to climate change, so our own efforts to adapt, have been varied in their outcomes across humanity. So This plot looks specifically at feasibility dimensions and also, so, which things are more or less feasible. And then benefits, or they're calling disbenefits, to different groups around the world. So we have seen that some efforts to adapt to climate change have left people behind. This includes marginalized populations, sometimes can include women, low-income populations, etc. And so this was a big note of caution about the idea that climate change isn't necessarily about techno fixes, right? You can't just be like, well, if everyone does this set of techno fixes, we'll be fine. But it is about the process by which we as a community decide how we're going to invest in resilience and make sure we aren't leaving people behind. So we're not creating crop insurance systems that are only available to the wealthy and early warning systems that only alert people who have cell phones and leave everybody else behind, for example. So this is another sort of big message in terms of these pathways forward. Lastly, I'd love to just do a deep dive into one of these adaptation options, which is the focus of my work. So my work is focused on extreme events, floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, etc. And one of the key adaptation opportunities that we have in front of us is early warning systems. So this was mentioned in every single chapter of the report. And we've been working on anticipatory action systems around the world to try to set up plans and financial mechanisms so that when there is an early warning of a potential disaster or extreme event, that people are alerted and they know what to do and they have the resources to take action. This has been coming back now full circle to COP26. This was something that was heavily promoted by the humanitarian community and others at COP26, and we saw some major goals be proposed over the last few years, including 1 billion more people covered by improved early warning systems around the world. So this is something that we are working on, really getting to agriculture, but just also human health and livelihood viability. There were a number of, I took a screenshot from this much longer Padlet where people were putting in outcomes from COP26 that relate to early action and how people are pushing the envelope in terms of ambition on adaptation and resilience. Because obviously we are all living here in this changed climate, so we need to be thinking about solutions that work in today's climate and also prevent climate change from getting worse in the future. So I'll leave it there with this sort of arc overview of this deep dive, and look forward to hearing the comments from the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was wonderful. We're going to invite Stephanie to present now.
All right. Give me 1 second while I share my screen properly. Okay. Sorry, it takes me a second there. Well, okay. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you all. I'm Stephanie Goodwin. I sit on the Public and Government Affairs team at Danone North America. I have a background in nutrition and public health, but for me, like what was said in my introduction, I first became really involved in thinking about what a healthy, sustainable food and nutrition system meant. Was when I was working on the federal government side of things for the 2015 dietary guidelines, and I was tasked with the subject. And as I learned more and more about this topic, I became quite passionate. And this passion is one of the reasons I joined Danone and why I continue to stay with Danone. Okay, to start, if we were in a room, I would say, how many of you have heard of Danone? And before joining the company, I would say that I didn't know the name Danone. And don't worry, I don't think most people do. A lot of people know us by our brand, so I'm going to move to that, sort of give you the snapshot of our brands. So our brands are mainly dairy and plant-based. We're a dairy and plant-based company. The specific brands that you might know us by are like Danone Yogurt, Danimals, Too Good, Oikos, Light and Fit, and Activia. We also have the brand Horizon Organic, which is dairy milk. And then on the plant-based side, if you look over on the right side of your screen, we have plant-based milk such as silk soy milk and almond milk, just to name a few. And then on the bottom left side, which is also was talked about in my introduction, is our medical foods division called Nutritia. So yeah, you might know us better by our brands rather than kind of our house name, as we say, Danone. But, I'm really hoping after this sort of lightning round of presentation, you'll come to think of us as more than just our brands or more than just food products, but really linked with a larger mission related to healthy, sustainable foods. So at Danone North America, we believe that when people choose the way they eat and drink, they can vote for the world that they want to live in. We know food is a deeply personal choice, and in choosing foods and brands that best meet our needs and those meet our personal values, we can influence the entire food system. The power of choice in food doesn't start and end with saying, oh, I just have this, craving, or I just want to grab this food. It really manifests in upstream and knowing where our food comes from, and further down the chain and how that's connected to our health, to the nutrition and the benefits that food provides us. Our mission at Danone is to bring health through food to as many people as possible. And we aim to inspire healthier and more sustainable eating and drinking practices, which is also in line with our vision, the One Planet, One Health. And that really reflects sort of the strong belief that the health of the people and the health of the planet are interconnected. This vision is a sign of our commitment to embrace the food revolution. I would say there's this new generation that increasingly challenges, and from my perspective, a welcome challenge to what was the traditional mainstream food system for so long, and while asking for a fresh approach. So what does sustainable foods mean to us at Danone? Well, although many of us, I would say I'm in a lot of discussions and have been, I think, since 2015 of what the actual definition of what sustainable food is. But I'm just going to give you kind of our approach. And really it's rooted in our frame of action, this One Planet, One Health. We understand that we have a responsibility to understand the impact of our practices and, that impact on health of people on the planet. And we're trying to make, and we're working to make a better, more sustainable and more regenerative food system. I think everybody here understands this, but I will just say it. A healthy food depends on a healthy planet. The worldwide population is increasing rapidly, and we need to find a way to feed everyone. But, too often the way we develop our food and our food production harms the environment. At Danone, we want to be part of the solution to fix our food system. And I won't go into each of these, but just broadly speaking, our approach is driven by 4 key ambitions: to fight climate change, protect water cycles, co-build a circular economy of packaging, and promote the practice of regenerative agriculture. Today's modern societies, again, you guys all know this probably even better than me, especially for those still in school studying this all the time. But we're facing major public health issues, especially on the backdrop of COVID-19 and with obesity and chronic disease. And then the other things that I think about is, food and nutrition insecurity sort of on top of these disease states. And especially for those most vulnerable populations, I think it's clear to me that it's not just going to be one group or one organization, but we really need an all hands on deck type of approach to improve the health and well-being of society. And so as a food company, we do have a social impact mission. And for some of our foods, not some of our foods, for our food portfolio, we're trying to build healthier products. So better products with improved nutrition quality, better choices for consumers to build, the healthy dietary pattern that works for you, and ultimately to provide one health for all. So one quick example, I'm not going to go deep into this, but definitely check out the webpage on this. I think this is the Horizon Organic Carbon Positive commitment is one of those One Planet, One Health. Dietary guidelines recommends dairy or fortified soy milk beverages as part of a healthy eating pattern. And Horizon has a commitment to be carbon positive, which I know sounds really funny at first when you hear it. It's going a little bit beyond that carbon neutral goal that you hear. And for us, this carbon positivity means achieving carbon neutrality and going even further to remove or prevent additional carbon from entering the atmosphere. Okay, so I also just want to put in a plug for some certifications and transparency, because you've got all this work going on, trying to make sustainable food systems, and there's a need for accountability and transparency that accompanies it. And I think there's a role for their certifications to really drive sort of meaningful progress and impact. You've probably heard of certifications related to product ingredients and attributes. Those are quite common. Some might even argue too common, but how do consumers, how do you know, and how can you believe and trust in the business behind the brands? And I think that's where B Corp comes in. So what the heck is B Corp? Again, if we were in a room, I'd say, how many of you have heard of B Corp? Again, I hadn't heard of it until we really became B Corp certified. And so just quickly here, my little animation, it's a movement, a global movement of people using business as a force for good. It's a community of practice to increase our individual and collective impact. Today, there's more than 3,800 B Corps across 74 countries, spanning more than 150 countries. And I would just encourage you to just take a look, see if your favorite brand, whether that's clothes or food or whatever, is B Corp certified. Just quickly, to achieve B Corp certification, a company must complete the B Impact assessment and achieve a score of at least 80 out of 200. It's got to meet the legal requirements to, for its corporate governance. And so for the United States, North America, it's a public benefit corporation. And then, of course, you've got to sign to be formal. B Corp for us means encouraging healthy dietary practices, promote a model of sustainable growth for both economic and social values, including our customers, employees, suppliers, and improving our impact on the government. Government. I'm in government affairs. Government sometimes comes out of my mouth. Impact on the environment. So really rethinking what success looks like. It's not just about the bottom line, just your financial, what kind of money you're making for businesses. I think we all at Danone really believe in the idea that we live in a world that's deeply connected. A company isn't just meant to make money anymore. There's a value that needs to be delivered just beyond shareholders, but also for the communities that we live in and work in and play in. And I think, I'm just bringing up B Corp again, because I think it's one of those movements that's setting the stage where business could go. It's where consumers, we're hearing, especially from the younger generations, where consumers want and expect business to go. It's where employees want to do. We want to work for companies that are have meaningful impact. Okay, and the last thing I'll say, and this is like my cheer time, but let's work together on all of this. I'm a huge proponent of working across all sectors, across all expertise, and I just think that the future of healthy, sustainable food systems, it starts with sort of this ambition from all of us to create a better, brighter, more equitable and food system. I mean, not just for us, but just for all of our future generations. And I think we all can do this together. That's really my last hurrah. We've got this.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a great inspiring note to end on. It's kind of one of the goals of this panel is to see the collaboration, so we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Last, can we hear from Carly?
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it now. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, especially thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to participate. Today, I look forward to sharing the role of blue foods in our global food systems today. To start off, I'm going to set a little bit of additional context. Today's food system, we're stuck in a vicious cycle. Climate change is rapidly changing the environment in which we grow and produce our food, while food systems are driving climate impact changes. My fellow panelist, Erin, thank you for sharing that IPCC report. Very important data that just came out, and it paints a dire picture of the already overtaxed food system. And food systems are not delivering for people. People are suffering as nearly 1 billion are undernourished, and that's a number that's expected to increase by 600 million over the next 8 years. And if we don't make changes now, it's going to get worse as climate change is going to impact food production. And this is especially true for blue foods. Fish are moving, fisheries as we know are changing, and the ability to support aquaculture is changing as well. And we're already seeing these impacts. It's not in the future. We're especially seeing them in the low latitude developing tropics, where climate change is already causing a net loss of seafood productivity. And unfortunately, these are also the populations that are most vulnerable to micronutrient deficiencies. So we need to break this cycle and transition to a new food future. This is where my work is focused. I'm focused on elevating the emerging science that has uncovered the vital role of blue foods in nourishing a growing population and how to translate that into policy and action on the ground. A quick point of clarification, blue foods are fish and shellfish, aquatic plants, and algae that are captured or cultivated in freshwater or marine ecosystems. Currently, over 3 billion people depend on blue foods for protein in addition to vital micronutrients and fatty acids that are not easily replaced. And there's been, over the last few years, robust and rapidly growing evidence, especially coming from the Blue Food Assessment, that demonstrates the potential of blue foods to meet nutritional needs and reduce these deficiencies in micronutrients and fatty acids, the ability to improve brain, heart, and eye health, as well as the important role of blue foods as a solution to environmental and climate challenges. They're also an engine of employment. 800 million people depend on blue foods for their livelihoods around the world. 9 out of 10 are small-scale fishers in developing economies. They also employ women. About 70% of aquaculture workforce is female, and roughly half of the workforce in wild fisheries is female as well. And blue foods make a contribution to SDGs. Making progress towards sustainable blue foods could help move the needle in 9 SDGs. And typically when we talk about blue foods or oceans, the focus is on SDG 14, but there's a bigger potential to make progress on 9 of them, not just SDG 14. But we have a challenge. We've been failing to think of fish as food, and the food and nutrition world has been failing to think of fish at all. I think this is really captured and highlighted in SDG 2, Zero Hunger, where the focus is on terrestrial agriculture systems, and there's no mention of fisheries or aquaculture and the role that they play. Additionally, the Global Nutrition Report mentions fish for the first time in 2017. So again, that's relatively recent that we're starting to think about fish as food. And this is reflected on how we invest in food systems globally. This is a chart from 4 development banks and their investment portfolio over 50 years, and their investment portfolio specific to blue foods. And you could see over the 50 years, for the most part, it hovers either at or below 10% of investment. And this goes both ways. In high-level fisheries policy, again, we don't think of fish as food. This is a chart that looks at how do we categorize blue foods in conversations at these dialogues. And the black at the top is when fish is referenced as food. So you could see it's very small. So it's been ignored in the fisheries debate or fisheries dialogue as well. So why is this important? These policy discussions and investments, funding investments, are really what's driving policies on the ground. And right now, since we're framing fish as food, not as food, and only as a natural resource, this focuses policy on species management and conservation, profits and high-value export-oriented fisheries, and leads to an underemphasis on nutritional characteristics, accessibility, seasonality, distribution inequity, and patterns of fish consumption. So we're at the point now where we need to invest in climate resilient fishery management and sustainable aquaculture and do so in a right way, because ultimately fish can be a climate smart food source. They have a lower carbon footprint than other animal-based foods. And as I mentioned earlier, they support fishers and communities globally. So now that we have this foundational science on the importance of blue foods to nutrition and how it's supporting livelihoods, and we understand what's at risk, we need to inform policy making and make changes. So we have 5 key recommendations. The first is we need to put blue foods at the heart of decision-making around food and nutrition. We finally need to think of fish as food. We need to protect and harness diversity for nutrition, accessibility, and environmental sustainability. We We need to manage these resources as a source of essential nutrients that could help end malnutrition. You need to identify or inform policies and practices that impede transformation, and this includes redirecting harmful subsidies. You need to recognize and support the central role of small-scale actors. Small-scale fisheries supply most of the blue foods for direct human consumption globally. It's also 90% of the fishery jobs. So another recommendation is that we need to commit to human rights and policy and practice. And then finally, we need to fund blue food research, collaboration, and innovation at scale. This year, we have made progress. At the UN Food Systems Summit, blue foods were recognized as a game-changing solution for food systems. It was the first time in a food dialogue that we were able to receive this recognition. As a result, a coalition was established and is currently chaired by Iceland and includes participation from over 20 governments, civil society, and fisher organizations to raise the profile of blue foods and food system decision-making, and to support projects on the ground through mobilizing technical and financial resources. The coalition's just a start. It's an opportunity to engage on the global scale to elevate the importance of blue food, especially as we look forward to 2022 global events, including the ocean conferences and the upcoming COP, where there's going to be the second ocean climate dialogue being held. So I'll pause there and I look forward to the question and answers.
Thank you so much, Carly. I'm just going to jump right into our moderator-led questions and then try to leave as much time as possible for our audience questions. Please throw your questions in the chat. We may not be able to get to everybody today, but we will try to make it possible to keep the conversation going after. What a great presentation from all of you guys. It was very inspiring. Just to start off, I want to ask a question to all four panelists. And the first question is, do you believe there must be a trade-off between what is the most evidence-based solution and what is the most feasible to enact on the scale required? Starting with you, Lana.
I think some of the solutions that I'm interested in is food systems and the NDCs, or the climate commitments of countries, and incorporating sustainability in the dietary guidelines as well, I think are both promising.
Great. And to you, Erin?
There you are. No, I agree. And I think I was showing in the slides a little bit some of these evaluations of feasibility, right? And so we evaluated a whole bunch. I mean, there's, different aspects of what makes something more or less feasible. Is it financially prohibitive? Is it difficult to get policy across, et cetera? But I think that there's a lot of evidence for some very feasible things that we can and should be doing. I mean, I think the future is in our hands here.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And Stephanie?
Sure, we can repeat the question, Stephanie. The question was, do you believe there must be a trade-off between what is the most evidence-based solution and what is the most feasible to enact on the scale required?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think about this is, climate isn't a future problem. It's here and it's now. I think, I'm a scientist, and having worked on the dietary guidelines, my experience is just that we wait so long for everything to be perfect. Is there a way that we can, with the evidence that we do know, where there's some promising results that we can move forward on without waiting for everything to be just so perfect and signed off by everyone in the world?
Great. And last, Carly.
I think that solutions should always be evidence-based, but do they have to be the most evidence-based? I don't think it has to be like that. I think there needs to be a balance between being able to scale and have the evidence behind it to back it. And I also think ensuring that solutions, even if they're the most evidence-based, may not be culturally appropriate. So you have to think about the setting that you're implementing them in.
Great point about the cultural appropriateness. I think this is one that often gets lost in conversations, especially conversations held in the global north, like this one based in Tufts in Boston. Over to you, Sadie, for the next question.
Perfect. Thank you, Susie. And thank you, everyone, for those thoughtful responses. We're Regarding sustainability, resilience, regenerative, these are all words to describe outcomes of transformations in our food and agriculture systems. And then within each of your specific expert opinions, what change do you see as being one of the most impactful in achieving outcomes like this? You can start off
Starting
again.
with you.
I can start again. For me, I've focused more on sustainable consumption. I found it to be really impactful because consumption patterns tend to fuel the production patterns that we see. So, for instance, in a country like the United States, a lot of the high levels of meat consumption that happen here tend to fuel some of the livestock production patterns that we find issue with happening in Brazil or around the Amazon. So I think that that can be closely linked, and changing on the consumption side for more sustainable and equitable can end up impacting across the food system. So that's where I've ended up focusing.
Great. And on to Erin.
Yeah, I would almost dodge the question by saying that there's a lot of evidence that shows that when people create their own solutions and are at the table to make decisions, those solutions are much more effective. There's some interesting research on, I don't know if any of you read the book about the checklist manifesto. So, a doctor that essentially worked with other doctors to set up a checklist to wash their hands before they did surgery. And all of a sudden, this dramatically reduced deaths in this hospital. And it was such a wonderful success story. And then they sort of imposed the checklist on other hospitals and did not see a dramatic reduction in deaths. And I think this is just a nice parallel for the fact that when many voices are at the table and you create your own solution, be it a checklist or whatever it is, you can have some pretty transformative outcomes. And so one of the things that we've been really pushing recently is this idea of everybody's voices at the table, making sure marginalized populations are having leadership voices, and this idea of creating pathways that are co-created.
Great. And Stephanie.
I think about feasibility. I think, what can have the biggest impact in the shortest time. I also think a lot about federal policy. So what kind of federal or national policy can help kind of support these sustainable, healthy food systems. And then lastly, and I feel like I will always come back to this, but how can we work together, public, private, government, and things like that, to really come up with the right solutions.
And last, Carly.
I completely agree with my panelists. I think that having diverse voices at the table are going to be important in co-creating solutions. And I also think now that we have the data and we're trying to change the trajectory of climate change, but we're also thinking about how we need to adapt. We're not trying to necessarily make all our solutions fit into what's going to happen right now, but how can we adapt our food systems because they're going to look different in the future.
Very important thing to consider going forward. Our next question is directed towards Lana and Stephanie. Lana and Stephanie, do you believe nutrition and sustainability goals can overlap? And if so, which sectors need to collaborate and cooperate the most in order to make that attainable?
I can start. I think they can definitely overlap, and being more in the youth space, I think that's something that I've seen is very much a breaking down of the silos that have traditionally existed, where nutrition is talked about in one space, climate is talked about in another. Youth definitely don't function that way, and I'm starting to see that even in spaces like COP and Food Systems Summit, a lot of those sectors are starting to come together across the world. So that is very exciting. I think that from the youth climate movement space, it's kind of interesting being in the food and nutrition area. It's not the same as the fossil fuel industry where you're like, we need to eradicate the companies here. The companies are what bring us the food. We can't really do that. So we need to work together. We need to talk about how to make it more sustainable, how to make it work for everyone. As Stephanie has been talking about, it's very different from the other fields in which youth climate activism has existed. And when we're talking about food, we need to work together with the companies.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty much my answer as well. I think, The other thing that I've been thinking about, and I'm a nutrition and public health person, and I'm new to the agriculture and environmental, even though I'm passionate about it, I don't quite have all the science like you all do. But one of the things that I think would be really useful and helpful is connecting sort of the health outcomes a little bit better. So of course we need people at the table, right? So I agree with you, Lana. We've got people in the environmental and agriculture space having conversations, and then we've got nutrition, and rarely are we just really sitting down together trying to understand what we could do to make this better. But something that I learned about last year is soil health and sort of the connection to human health, right? And so climate change is going to have an impact on the soil and the soil health. That might impact nutrient quality or nutrient density. There's also microbes and stuff that it could impact. And that might impact the food that you eat and then impact the health outcomes of somebody. And I think, at least from my perspective, is there a way we can do a better job of connecting those dots to specifically help, thinking about nutrition, public health, health outcomes on human health? That's one way I've been thinking about, is there a place for an improvement on that?
Thank you very much, both of you. Those were excellent answers, and I love the agreement we're having across the panel here. Next questions is for Erin and Lana. Do you feel that the true costs of climate change are being accurately assessed and reported in the current ways? And that can be from your experiences or your understanding of COP26, or more generally within your field.
Sure. I think the answer is no. I think we're probably preaching to the choir here in that, we all live on planet Earth, and planet Earth has a changed climate. Our climate today is fundamentally different than it was 50 to 100 years ago. So that is manifesting in all sorts of ways all the time. Just warmer temperatures alone are affecting crop production pretty much everywhere. And so no, I don't think we are accurately assessing, just because there's such an extent. So yeah, I'll leave it there because I know we don't have a huge amount of time.
And last comments from the moderator questions from Lana.
I'm really glad that Erin went first, because I didn't want to say to the scientists, no, we're not assessing climate change impacts accurately, but there's so much more that can't really be measured. For instance, the climate anxiety impacts on my generation, we can't really put that into numbers. So there's definitely impacts out there that we can't even quantify in what's happening.
Great. Okay, so I have the first question from the audience. I think these are all very important questions, but this question is directed towards all four panelists. And it is, how can we leave larger, quote, margins of error so we don't outstrip planetary boundaries that we don't even see yet? Starting with Lana.
I'd like to pass this question to someone else. I need some more time, honestly. It's a good
Absolutely.
question.
Erin?
Sure. There's been a lot written about the idea of the precautionary principle, right? And so if we can apply this precautionary principle to our choices, that can leave us a little bit of margin of error. Frankly, I don't think we've done a great job leaving margin of error so far. Let's say this. There are irreversible impacts of climate change that have happened today. We have lost some ecosystems, and that we will never get back. The end. There's nothing we can do about it. And so, preventing more such loss, I think, is, if you are talking about any sort of margin of error, would require pretty radical change to how we live our lives. And that's really what we're asking for.
Pretty sobering to think about. Stephanie?
I want to know more. Like I said, I'm new to this science, so please teach me. I don't know.
Carly?
I agree. Precautionary principle, especially in fisheries and thinking about how much we need to take or can take out of the ocean, is important. I think that over the last few years, there's been amazing advancements in data limited assessments of fisheries and having barefoot ecologists understand the status of the resource. So there's more people engaged and more ways to grasp how your resource is doing over the last few years, that I think we're getting better and better, and we're trending in the right direction. So hopefully we don't have to, we're not going to come to this error point if we have the right pieces in place, and also that's supported by policy.
Thank you. And then to you, Carly, we have a question from the audience on your presentation on the mentions of fish visualization. Is the data based primarily on the English language mentions of fish or on multiple languages? They were curious if fish is referenced as a food more often in different cultures and geographies.
Sure. So the presentation or the graphic, that's from about 100, it's an effort called the Blue Food Assessment. It's from about 100 different scientists over 25 different institutions globally. So it is a global effort. And it's also looking at policy pieces. So looking at the policy and how they reference. So we're looking at fish, algae, shellfish. So it's more comprehensive.
Great, thank you. We have time for just one last question from the audience. We are planning to end this session today at 3:55. The last question is to Erin. Erin, there's interest in the audience about whether there are projects done by children. And I think there were some other questions I'm just gonna sort of combine together about things gathering data from children or programs towards children that included questions about Danone. So I would start with Erin and then go on to Stephanie. Erin.
Yeah, and I saw the question and wasn't entirely sure under what sphere you were asking. So if you're talking about what I was saying about early warning systems and anticipatory action, there is absolutely a focus on children. So, in families in particular who are at risk of extreme events. More, of course, that can be done in that. If you were asking about the IPCC, there was certainly an assessment of the impacts on child health and the agency of youth and children in terms of what they are doing to try to deal with climate change. So hopefully, I'm not exactly sure which thing you were asking that I had mentioned, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an answer. Go ahead.
And Stephanie, I believe the question for Danone was aimed at school-facing programs and food-related products for children.
Yeah, I'm reading the question, I think now on education. So I don't know about rural children and orphans in Africa. We do have global colleagues that might be able to answer that question. But here in the US and in my role, I work a lot on federal policy, and we do support, say nutrition education in schools and things like that. We're also supportive of the school meals program, WIC, SNAP Ed, and things like that. And so I think that's just part of, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with our products. It's more just sort of aligning with this health through food to as many people as possible and making sure that, kids have the right education to make the right choices for their own health.
Thank you all for coming today. It was a very lively conversation, and our upcoming talk, next on the agenda, there is a career talk for agriculture, food, and the environment. You can find the schedule on the website, and you can also keep the conversation going on Twitter. Tufts Nutrition Twitter is live tweeting throughout the symposium, including quotes and snippets from this. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank the Tufts Tech, Michael for tech support, and all of you for coming today. Thank you so much.